Is that an okay?
Hi, I'm Steve Ivesdahl, Chapter President of the Kansas City Chapter. Today I'm honored to be part of a leadership recall to review a career and the great contributions that one of our members have made to the society and to the industry as a whole. And that individual is Dr. Fred Rohles, and we're here at Kansas State at a classroom setting. And Fred, it's really great to be part of this with you.
Glad you're at Kansas State, Steve.
Sure. And we enjoyed the trip down. We had good weather for a change. Being January, you never know what you'll get in Kansas, huh? Well, Fred, we'll kind of break this up in about 4 parts. We'd like to kind of go back to your roots, where you were born and raised, and where you went to high school and into your college and move into your career, and of course into ASHRAE, and talk about some of the awards you won over the years. So I'm going to kind of turn it over to you and just ask you to give us a little sketch of your early life, where you started and where you got your school background and so forth.
Well, I was born in Chicago, grew up in Evanston, Illinois, which is the first suburb north.
No, Evanston is the home of Rotary.
Yes, it is.
I'm a Rotarian,
right.
too.
Yes, it is. That's their national headquarters.
Yeah.
Been by there many times.
Sure.
And the graduated from Evanston High School, was quite active in sports there, and then went to Roosevelt University, which is essentially a city college in Chicago. And there was an event that came along called World War II, and there were, that's right, and so I enlisted in April of 42, April of 42.
I see.
And I should get back off and tell you that my major there was Commerce and Personnel Administration.
Sure.
And they were opening up psychological research units, and these were designed to test the candidates for pilot, bombardier, and navigator training. And there were 3 in the country, one in Nashville, Santa Ana, and San Antonio. And so I enlisted on a Monday, and Friday I found myself in San Antonio. I was there as an enlisted man for about 5 months, and then went to OCS in Miami Beach and was commissioned as second lieutenant.
OCS, you put yourself through that back then.
That's right, 90-day wonder.
90-day wonder?
That's right.
Is that what it was back then, a 90 days?
90 days, that's right.
Days, huh?
90 days, right.
Evanston back in those days, was that considered part of Chicago like it is
Oh,
today?
never.
Way out in the country.
That's the headquarters of the WCTU.
Oh, yeah.
And
Sure.
And the right at the border, there are liquor stores on one side of the street and churches on the other.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, that's right. Now it's not that way. Now
Yeah.
I think that they have bars in Evanston.
Sure. Well, anyway, we got off track, but now you went into the Army.
Air Force.
Air Force.
I went in the Air Force.
What you do? We got to mess up your microphone there.
Went in the Air Force, and after I was commissioned, came back into the same unit that I was in. And here again, still doing testing and classification of people going into aircrew duties. I got out of the service in 1945, I guess it was, 46, and I was out 6 weeks, and my boss called me back, and he said, I want you to come on back and go to work for me as a civilian. So I did, and then we had 3 teams that were touring the country doing the same type of testing.
I see.
My boss in Washington at the time said, Fred, if you come back on active duty, he said, I'll get you a graduate school. And this looked like a pretty good deal, so I did. And so I got my master's and PhD courtesy of the United States Air Force.
Oh, good for you.
And But anyway, I went to the University of Texas, got my master's degree, and then came back and was stationed at the School of Aerospace Medicine in San Antonio. I was there about a year, and then got one of the best duties I think I had in my entire professional career, and that was at the Arctic Aeromedical Research Laboratory in Fairbanks, Alaska. There we were working primarily with firefighters. And if you can ever think of the extreme environment as far as work is concerned, these poor devils had to have had it. I mean, sloshing around in water at 50 below zero, and clothing, and we had, fortunately or not, 2 major fires, and I've never seen such miserable conditions for these poor devils working around there.
I've often thought of that. That'd have to be the worst thing that happened to you.
Terrible.
Fighting in a below zero weather with...
I think of just coupling hoses.
Yeah.
And then the spray coming off.
Sure.
And I saw a whole barracks filled with clothes that were just solid ice.
Solid ice.
Solid ice. And the main job was replenish the coal so that people could keep on going.
Okay.
The steam plant burned, and it burned for about 30 hours. And things like shoes. Anyway, there was an equipment problem, and as I say, and talk about getting involved in the thermal environment. I think that was my first exposure.
Sure.
Then after my doctorate at the University of Texas, I went back to the School of Aerospace Medicine, and was there for about a year, and then transferred to the Human Engineering Laboratory at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. There I was head of what was called the Unusual Environment Section, and unusual environments at that time was space environments.
Space environment,
right.
Certainly unusual.
And I was on a preaching mission saying that was when they were putting animals into space.
See, now that, monkeys and dogs.
Well, dogs, the Russians put the dogs up.
Okay, that's right.
Right after that happened, why my boss in Washington called me in, and he said, I'm going to put you on a Joint Services Biosatellite Coordination Committee. And this consisted of 2 naval personnel, 2 from the Army, 4 from the Air Force. And we gallivanted all over the country preaching this. And my main influence, incidentally, I am not an engineer. I'm an experimental psychologist.
Yeah.
And the question always arises, what's a nice, clean-cut psychologist cavorting around with a bunch of engineers for?
Engineers, yeah.
And the response that I give universally is that, for whom do you heat and air condition? People.
People, yeah.
And so this is what it...
so you spent your career trying to figure out the physiological effects.
That's right.
That's right. What the engineers are trying to make people be satisfied with.
And primarily as a member of a multidisciplinary team. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I think about the situation that we had here at Kansas State. Ralph Nevins was responsible for getting this institute in here, and I'll get ahead of that. Anyway, but we had a psychologist myself, a physiologist, Emerson Besch, who later headed up Standard 55. We had engineers, statisticians, and physicians, and engineers, and worked as a team. And I think this was the strength of the organization that we had here. Well, anyway, as I said, I was preaching about you have to do something other than measure the physiology of these animals. You have to measure their performance. In other words, can you perform a task in space that you've learned on the ground?
Sure.
And so my boss in Washington called me in, and he said, I want you to go and head up a unit at Holloman Air Force Base in Alamogordo, New Mexico, and get the chimpanzees ready to go into Project Mercury.
Well, that must have been pretty exciting.
It was an exciting time. It really was.
And so you were directly involved with that space venture.
Well, that was Project Mercury. And the first flight was with a chimpanzee named HAM, and that was the acronym for Holloman Aeromedical Research Laboratory. And then following that was Shepherd with a ballistic shot. And then after that, we put up another chimpanzee, Enos, and he was supposed to be on a 3-orbit shot, only went on 2, and then after that was John Glenn. And and we're supposed to do a whole bunch of other programs, but the whole animal thing phased out.
So did you get to actually work with John Glenn then? Were you
When I was at the Aeromedical Research Laboratory in Dayton, I was involved in the selection, not directly, but I mean they would send us all the results of physiology and performance tests and that sort of stuff, and we would have to go through there. But the only dealings I've had with John Glenn was a limerick that I'd written about him that I sent him about 6 weeks ago, and I mentioned the fact that we had the chimpanzees' names were Ham and Enos, and the limerick goes like this. And I tell you this,
sure,
Steve?
I'd like that.
I've said it again and again. If you don't think I'm right, ask John Glenn. That his wisest of tips came from chimpanzees' lips, from old Enos and Ham, not from men. And I got a letter back from him, and he had written a limerick that had my name involved in it. So it was that's the extent of my dealings with.
It's timely now that John Glenn just returned back from space.
That's right.
I guess that was November of '98, or wasn't it?
It was this fall. Yes.
Yeah, quite recently.
That's right. So anyway, I got out of the service in October of 1963. But prior to that, my old professor and mentor at the University of Texas had left there and became the first Regents professor here at K-State.
Oh, yeah.
And that was Harry Helson. And so he called me and he said, you know, they're opening up this Institute for Environmental Research, and he said, I think you ought to come. He said, be a natural for the kind of stuff that you're doing in the service. You've been in the service. And I said, not Kansas. I said, I was stationed there one time, and I said, not that at all. So it kind of died, and about 6 months later, he called me again. And he said, Fred, I think you should at least give us the courtesy of coming to Manhattan and looking at it. I said, Harry, look, there's got to be water where I retire. He said, we have a brand new lake. And Lyndon Johnson has just dedicated the new Tuttle Creek Reservoir here. So I came up, and that was at Memorial Day weekend in 1963. I bought a house. It was a natural, doing exactly the same kind of stuff I'd been doing in the service. And came to work here the 1st of November 1963. And now let me back off a bit.
Sure.
And this is part of the paper I presented in Chicago 5 years ago, having to do with the history of the Institute. ASHRAE had a laboratory starting with the Bureau of Mines in Pittsburgh, and then they moved that to Cleveland. And then with the increased cost of doing it, running that laboratory, and this was an ASHRAE-run laboratory, well, they essentially put it up for grabs at any organization who wanted to continue with it. And at the time, Ralph Nevins was very active in ASHRAE, and it looked like a pretty good piece of hardware to latch on to. And so he got funds from the state of Kansas and matching funds from the federal government. And with this package of promises, essentially, went to ASHRAE and said, should it come to Manhattan, this is what we can offer you, which is essentially a building in which to house that facility. And so that was approved by ASHRAE and became operational about the 4th or 5th of November. As I say, I came on board the 1st November '63, and about 4 or 5 days later, we had our formal dedication.
I see. So that was kind of your entrance into what we consider HVAC was when you came to K-State.
That's right.
And so what were some of the early projects you worked on?
Well, accompanying the environmental laboratory was the requirement to validate the then current standards for thermal comfort. And to that end, we tested some 800 men and 800 women at different temperatures and humidities, and essentially formed a baseline for any subsequent work that along that same line.
So your work was more engineers think they know what makes what people are comfortable at, and your job was to say this is what they're really comfortable at with the temperatures and the air drafts and all those kinds of things. I don't think there couldn't have been a lot of people in ASHRAE back then with that type of background that you had.
There still isn't.
Pretty unique.
There still isn't, and I've had students that I'd like to go ahead and encourage in that direction, because here again I think that the multidisciplinary approach to problems like this are very, very meaningful, and what it does, it gives you an entirely new dimension when you get a particular finding.
Yeah. I know what always brings to my mind when you're doing HVAC is the discharge air may be over 100 degrees. It might be 120 degrees, but if it's blowing fast on you, it's drafty, and it feels miserable.
Sure.
But just looking at it from a technical point of view, you'd think, well, that would probably feel okay. So that was the kind of thing that you were dealing with.
Well, what I have labeled something similar to that, the supermarket syndrome. In Kansas, in the summertime, when you park your car, and Steve, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, when you park your car in a parking lot and you get in it, why, it'll be about 125, 140 degrees.
Yep.
All right, you get out of that air-conditioned car and you go into a supermarket that's at 72 or 73, something like that. Then you get back in that car.
Yeah.
And you think you're going to come unglued.
Yeah.
And this is the thing. But the human organism is very, very adaptable, and gets all right.
So your first exposure to ASHRAE was when did you join ASHRAE?
I presented the first paper at a Denver meeting in 1971. Now I came here in '63 and presented the first paper in '71. And that was due primarily to a fellow by the name of Pharaoh Gaggy. Gaggy just recently got into the Hall of Fame, ASHRAE Hall of Fame. And I worked for Gaggy when I was in the Air Force. He was a colonel in the Air Force at the Pierce Laboratories in New Haven, Connecticut, and I worked for him. And so when I came aboard here, I had no idea I was going to be involved with him at all. So he opened this, he had this seminar at the ASHRAE meeting in Denver, where I presented a paper, and he and Jim Hardy, who was also at Pierce Laboratories, said, "Fred, this is an organization you ought to get involved with. You ought to join."
I see.
And I said, what would a fellow with my background do in here? And he said, "We need people like that."
Sure.
And so that was essentially it.
Well, that's great. Well, looking at your ASHRAE background, in 1985 you received the Outstanding Technical Paper Award. Tell me a little about that topic, and do you remember it? That long ago?
Yes, we were looking at, let me think here, Steve. What happened, we worked with Honeywell, and they had a formula for the thermal situation in different building envelopes. And so we were looking at what happens when you brought the people in and you had a slow rise in temperature or slow decline in temperature. And that was it. And you could tie it in with the energy thing. But it was, here again, we worked with Dick Ruck, who was with Honeywell, a graduate student of mine, a graduate student from China, who was here, the four of us.
And then in '64, you received the Raymond Longacre Award on aerospace medicine.
That was the Aerospace Medical Association, and that was primarily because of the input that I had with the animals on the Project Mercury program, and also involved, we took and rode people on centrifuges to look at various G levels on them, and isolation problems, heat stress problems, and the like. So this was all in the behavioral side of it, not necessarily the physiology.
Sure. As you've progressed and worked with ASHRAE, what have you recognized that probably brought on growth in the industry through ASHRAE's efforts?
Well, I think I alluded to the fact that ASHRAE was willing to accept people from other disciplines. And I think that I like to think, because I'm from another discipline,
Sure.
is one of the major contributing aspects to ASHRAE's strength.
Yeah, I've thought the same thing. You're saying that ASHRAE is strong because they're willing to bring in all kinds of disciplines,
right.
not just engineering.
Well, let's see, was it Toronto or the meeting before? Regardless,
Sure.
they had a meeting of getting other professional organizations involved with ASHRAE.
Yeah.
The Aerospace Medical Association is interested in air quality in aircraft.
Yes, that's a big deal now.
That's right. And so here again, this is an organization, I'm associate fellow there, and an organization get involved. I'm a fellow in the Human Factors Society,
You know,
and that's another thing that they could get involved in.
I chuckle when I hear that because I've spent a lot of time in airplanes, and I've sat there and I said,